Okay. Good morning to everybody. Welcome to this panel dedicated to using health data in pandemics, the issue ahead of this Computers, Privacy and Data Protection International Conference. My name is Paolo Guarda. I come from the University of Trento, and it's an honor for me to be here to be the moderator of this very interesting panel with all these very valuable speakers. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizer of the panel, so the Panelfit project, funded by the European Commission 2020 within the Science Within for Society program. As you probably know, we have a very interesting panel, very interesting set of speakers. They come from different background. They have different approaches, so it's going to be very fruitful for our debate and discussion. We have Veronique, Cimina. I'm going to present them properly before the presentation speeches. Fedirica Lucivero from the University of Oxford, Ricardo Baeza-Yates from the Northeastern University, Bay Area, and Iñigo de Miguel, Beriain, University of the Basque Country. So the topic is dedicated to pandemics, to the using health data in pandemics, the issue ahead. We may start also with the presentation. And so we have you have already read in the program that you downloaded the main question, the main topics we are gonna try to provide a reply to address. So the using and the processing of data produced by digital health devices, using artificial intelligence, the framework, the regulatory framework, using health data within the research purposes. I can start with my presentation. I guess you are watching it, seeing it. So before giving the floor to the speakers, I'm going to waste your time for 5 minutes and just sharing with you some main ideas, main points that I want to stress. And there are general ones, but I guess there may be important issues and important aspect that we have to take into account when we are dealing with this kind of consideration, with this kind of topics. So the first point I want to stress with you, and using time for 5 minutes, is the idea of responsibility. I'm abusing of this sentence, actually. I'm always using it when I'm dealing with privacy. With great power comes great responsibility. And probably somebody has already guessed where I got the quotation. It's a proverb popularized by Spider-Man. So the comic written by Stan Lee, and actually was the uncle of Peter Parker pronouncing this sentence. And actually the regulation regarding data protection revolves around this sentence. Whoever manages, control, process information related to someone must perceive the power she has, and therefore her action has to be governed by principles and responsibilities. So the data protection regulation actually is revolving around this sentence: great power, great responsibility. We have always to take into account, if you want to use the terminology of the accountability instead of responsibility, but that's the idea. The second issue I want to stress, and the second point I want to stress, is the idea of dignity. Privacy actually, first of all, protect the dignity of people. That's why it's such an important right, even when we in the everyday life activity is taken for granted or perceived as a sort of bureaucratic burden for you. The European legislator actually is a world leader with reference to that. Our regulation dates back to 1995, as you know, and recently defined by the famous GDPR. It represents a benchmark at the global level. And despite we may have some limitation, we may criticize it, we can also be proud of this piece of regulation and trying to process and to govern this kind of scenarios. There are various meanings and dimensions of privacy. And one of them is very pivotal in this aspect is the so-called decisional privacy. So the awareness of monitored leads to change our behavior. The most famous example of that is the panopticon of Bentham that you probably know. So a prison with a radial structure where a single watchtower is controlling all the cells. The prisoner are not sure that the guard is looking at them that precise moment, but just the possibility of that leads them not to violate the rules, so to conform to a certain type of behavior. one person controls. Actually, our society, however, gradually become a sort of synopticon where many persons control everybody, or better, everybody is controlled by everybody, or everybody is controlling everybody. So it's this kind of awareness has a direct impact in reference to our personal identity. So to the social projection of the individual's personality, which is linked to the interest of the subject to be represented with a true identity, not to see modified or blurred intellectual heritage or ideological thoughts. In the digital context, this is, reflect in digital identity, of course. So in an era where data represents everything, where somebody's talking about data, so the religion of data, when everything is governed by algorithms and individuals are no longer user of the services offered online, but they become a product. So the human being is commodified. As privacy is perhaps the last bulwark, the last bastion to protect our personal digital identity. So privacy tends to be a fundamental principle, right, within the digital context. It's the last bastion for protecting other kind of rights and principles. The third issue, the third point, is the idea of balance, the proper balance. And that's, again, pivotal in our context, in any kind of debate or discussion related to privacy. The right to privacy was born as a principle that must necessarily be balanced in the different application scenarios and context. The interest of the single person, the individual, to keep secret some private information with respect to the interest of the public opinion to get access to that information because of the type of the information, because of the type of the person, a public person. So in our scenario, this right is precisely balanced with security and public health issues, which depend on various variables related to an historical context. So public health, public safety, the maintenance of the healthcare system are principles which, if properly balanced, may also determine a temporary limitation of our privacy. Of course, always taking into account the main principles that we have to implement and adopt. And in our context, stated in Article 5 of the GDPR, lawfulness, fairness, transparency, data minimization, proportionality, also effectiveness with reference to some of these tools. So the state of emergency may legitimize, albeit limited in time and well-defined limitation of privacy. And the last point is a provocation in a way. We write a measure of contact tracing, for instance, maybe, or possible strategy of sharing personal data of people for source purposes or for contrasting the pandemic. Within a context of exceptional seriousness, very often envisaged through a system that we consider democratic and put in place by public bodies. We are often rightly focusing on the individual, on rights, prerogatives. The contingent situation is obliging us to think in a different way. It's obliging us to think more much in terms of community, of group. We contrast the pandemic if we act as a community, if we act as a group. So even from this perspective, the awfully little sacrifice in terms of privacy could find a justification, extra-juridical one, of course, in the quest for the common good. So a sacrifice, if requested, in view of the contrast and we hope the defeat of this pandemic. So I stop myself, and I want to waste your time with my thoughts. We will be back at the end of the session. For the audience, I will also track your questions for the speakers. I will leave some rooms at the end of the panel for having the question time. So please, if you want to write them during the speeches, you can do that, but better if you do that at the end, and we will have time for talking about your questions with the speakers. So I start the panel with the first speaker, Veronique Cimina. Veronique is a legal officer in the Policy and Consultation Unit at the European Data Protection Supervisors. She contributes at the work of the GDPR on providing advice to the European Commission and other EU institutions and bodies on legislative and policy proposal. Veronique is talking about using health data in pandemics, the issue ahead. Veronique, The floor is yours. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Paolo, for your kind introduction, and also for your initial presentation, which touches upon three key aspects that we always have to keep into account. So moving ahead, I will deal with three points in my presentation, namely the issue of 2020 and COVID-19. So the challenges that data protection authorities have faced at the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Then I will go into the forthcoming issues, so the forthcoming challenges that we see ahead of us, and then conclude with some partial lessons learned so far, if already, let's say, in terms of the lessons that we have learned. So starting from the COVID-19 outbreak challenges that data protection authorities have had to face in 2020, we can indeed start from the fact that the role of data protection in the fight against pandemic has been immediately clarified, and then multiple issues have been dealt with, such as the use of mobile location data to monitor the spread of the pandemic, but also contact tracing applications and the effect of COVID-19 on scientific research, and indeed point also the issue of body temperature checks, which was also at the core of discussions at the outbreak of the pandemic. Let me just mention that the European Data Protection Supervisor from the beginning of the pandemic has called for a pan-European approach to deal with the crisis. And so I would start moving into the key discussion on the role of data protection in the fight against pandemic. So immediately when it became evident that we were in an emergency situation, the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, released a statement on the processing of personal data in the context of the COVID-19 outbreak. And here it reiterated principles such as the importance of purpose limitation, the need for transparent information to data subjects, and also the need for adequate security measures and confidentiality policies. But most of all, the European Data Protection Board underlined the fact that data protection indeed not an obstacle to the fight against the pandemic, and this was essential in order to move forward. And then the discussions also started developing towards the use of mobile location data to monitor the spread of the pandemic. As European Data Protection Supervisor, we gave comments to DG Connect of the European Commission with regards to the monitoring of the COVID-19 spread. And indeed, the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, also developed specific guidelines on the use of location data and contact tracing tools in the context of the COVID-19 outbreak. In particular, the EDPB reflected on the sources of location data used to monitor the spread of the pandemic, but it also reiterated the key principles such as the fact that preference should be given to the processing of anonymous personal data in this context, and also highly encouraged the need for transparency regarding the anonymization methodology. Moving then into the discussion on contact tracing applications that I'm going to just briefly touch and refer to the fact that the same guidelines on the use of location data and contact tracing tools also dealt with the issue of contact tracing applications. And there we can see how the European Data Protection Board gave some recommendation and guidance as to the use of such applications. The EDPB recommended that the controller of any contact tracing application should be clearly defined, that the purposes must be specific enough to exclude further processing for purposes that are unrelated to the management of the crisis, encouraged careful consideration to the principle of data minimization and data protection by also underlined the fact that these should be voluntary based and also focused on the compliance with the Privacy Directive and the GDPR. And in terms of the discussion between centralized and decentralized option, both were considered as viable options, provided that adequate security measures were in place. I will not go into all of the details, but I would still highlight the fact that this guidance indeed followed the principles that were also highlighted by Paolo in his introduction. And then with regards to scientific research, well, COVID-19, let's say due to the emergency, many scientific research efforts were put in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, and the objective was indeed to produce research results as fast as possible. And in this regard, the EDPS had published a preliminary opinion on scientific research in January 2020, so even before, let's say, the outbreak of the pandemic. And then, in response to this pandemic, the European Data Protection Board also released in April 2020 guidelines on the processing of data concerning health for the purposes of scientific research. Now, here I have indeed underlined, let's say, the main outcomes and recommendations that the European Data Protection Board gave with regards to scientific research. I will not go into all of the conclusions given by the DPB. I would just highlight two important aspects. So the first one, again, the fact that the GDPR provides special rules to the processing of health data for the purpose of scientific research, and that these are also applicable in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, going back to the key principle that data protection is in fact, and the GDPR are not do not hinder, let's say, the fight against the pandemic. And then also the fact that the guidelines of the EDPB also dealt with the issue of international transfers, which I think was particularly important in terms of underlining the need, let's say, to ensure so a specific part on international transfers, which let's say explained the application of possible derogations, yet still keeping in mind that these have exceptional character only. And then moving forward, I'd just like to touch upon briefly the issue of body temperature checks. And in this regard, in September 2020, as EDPS, we have published orientations for European institutions in the context of the COVID-19 crisis with regards to the use of body temperature checks. And here we, of course, the regulation that applies to European institutions is the regulation 2018-1725, not the GDPR. However, in our assessment, we distinguish between basic body temperature checks and other systems of temperature checks that are followed by processing of individuals' personal data. And so we have defined these as subject to the regulation, while we have indeed considered basic body temperature checks that are operated manually but are not followed by registration, documentation, or other processing of individuals' personal data as not subject to the regulation. And then, of course, we have reiterated principles like data protection safeguards needed and data protection by design and by default, and that temperature checks on a mandatory basis should not only be based on automated processing, but also have some sort of human involvement. And so I would move into the discussion as to the issues ahead in 2021. Well, we can see the discussions moving forward with regards to vaccination certificates, which are indeed different from the issue of immunity passports, as we also know that having the infection, having the virus does not give you a long lasting immunity, but also the issue of enhancing scientific research. And in this regard, I would like to highlight the forthcoming European Data Protection Board guidelines on the processing of personal data for scientific research purposes, but also the Commission legislative initiative on the European health data space, which is meant to enhance the policy-making decision and scientific research to the creation of this health data space. And in this regard, as EDPS, we have also published last November an opinion, preliminary opinion on the European health data space. But also, we also see, referring also to in fact what Paolo has just mentioned, how we can see a discussion coming up on how we can build a healthier and safer digital future in the long term. Just as a side event to CPDP, we have organized a webinar exactly on this, where we have in fact discussed how data can be used for the public good. So last but not least, I just want to highlight a few of the partial lessons that we have learned so far. I will sound repetitive, but I really like to stress this point that data protection rules do not hinder measures taken in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this is quite important to highlight, and this has been quite evident in the solutions that have been adopted. And also the need for a pan-European approach to health crisis, and also the need for interoperable solutions at EU level. Also, briefly, I would like to highlight that indeed only through active collaboration between public health authorities, epidemiologists, developers, and data protection authorities, we can ensure that the solutions developed today will not have unintended consequences tomorrow. We have also understood that technology and data played and will continue to play a very important role in managing the current crisis, but in particular only used as a tool to empower rather than to control, stigmatize, or repress citizens. We have also understood that technology is by no means a silver bullet, so that technological solutions should also take into account the intrusiveness of their functionalities and ensure compliance with EU personal data protection and privacy legislation. And last, I would just, if you allow me to conclude, the fact that the health crisis has indeed accelerated digitalization and increased the need to effective guarantees concerning data protection and privacy. We have also understood how a digital health connection has become even more essential, and that indeed, as a result, we need to improve accessibility, effectiveness, and sustainability of the electronic health systems used worldwide. Last but not least, I'd like to conclude with the statement that indeed data will need to aid the public good, in particular when it comes to scientific research or AI, and that the success of any new tool that is developed to face any upcoming pandemic or crisis would need to assure a lawful, responsible, and ethical approach, including the respect for fundamental rights. So with this, I thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Veronique. It's a perfect first introduction and first speak with reference to our panel, because providing a proper overview of all the issues involved, legal issues, but also technical issues. And you also, introduced some points that we are gonna talk about again with the other speakers. So thank you very much, Veronique. And so I'm moving to the next speaker. So that's Fedirica Lucivero from the University of Oxford. Federica is senior researcher in data and ethics at the Ethics and Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities. And she's going to talk about COVID-19 and apps for digital contact tracing, ethical challenges, and normative positions. So Federica, the floor is yours. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you, Paolo, and good morning, everyone. So my talk today is about digital contact tracing apps that have been recently developed and introduced around the world in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And Veronique has talked a bit about them. So they have been proposed as a tool to support traditional forms of contact tracing carried out to monitor contagion to ease lockdown measures. So these apps have triggered an intense debate with respect to their legal and ethical permissibility, their social desirability, and their general feasibility. And in particular today, I want to discuss the debate on the ethics of these apps that has unfolded in Europe between March and July 2020. So I will reflect on this debate using empirical data that we collected during this month through a qualitative interview study. So it's important to notice that as similar systems were already used in Asia, when the idea of implementing these apps landed in Europe, the discussion put issues of data protection, as we saw, like Veronique discussed, so data protection and privacy at the very center of the debate. And the model was that was almost immediately agreed upon in all European countries and groups working on these issues was that we would use a Bluetooth technology instead of geolocation, of using like geolocation data to identify proximity to devices. So as you see in the slide, the idea is that the app calculates how near app users are to each other by evaluating the strength of each phone's low energy Bluetooth signal. So basically, the app produces a randomly generated code that is collected by the app installed on other users' phones when one comes in close contact with them, and it is held there for a certain number of days. And then if one app user receives a positive, that we can see like in the second part of the picture, if one app user receives a positive test result for coronavirus, then the app will generate some keys that can be used to alert other users' apps. So the point here is not going into the discussion, the very interesting actually discussion also about the technicalities of these and the data journeys and the data flows. There is a session after hours that will definitely probably go in more detail in it, and there is another session I think tomorrow. So what I'm interested in discussing now is really the debate on the permissibility of these apps that exploded last spring. As it has been pointed out by some commentators, as it has been pointed out by some commentators, the public and policy debates on digital contact tracing apps have tended to unfold around a dichotomic framing of the issues at stake, whereby one option was assessed against the other on the basis of a perceived trade-off between infringement of privacy and the improvement of public health. And again, Veronique mentioned that, saying, well, that doesn't have to be that way. But it is true that initially this seemed to be some kind of the trade-off people were talking about. For example, a case in point is offered by the debate on whether the app should follow a centralized or a decentralized model. Again, next session will all be about that, I think. But and I'm not going to go into the details, but what I want to highlight here is that in this debate between these two groups, we can see how promoters of each approach were actually promoting some values over others. So both approaches aimed at preserving privacy, but each one of them enabled some functionalities and prevented some others. So what we see is that the supporters of the centralized model argue that the system would allow the use of data for research, public health surveillance, in some cases, enforcement of isolation, and the monitoring of fraud, for example. While the localized model didn't enable some of these functions in name of a stronger protection of privacy. So the frame has been between privacy on the one hand and public health on the other. And this has somehow also emerged in the scholarly debate. So we see that we see that a major strand of the debate has focused on concerns about privacy and data protection, such as issues around anonymity and data storage, but also has been discussing how to balance infringement of individual privacy against both the right to liberty of movement, for example, or public health needs. Some other scholars have engaged with the question in the context of the different options, whether the app should be like voluntary or mandatory. And again, it was like it seemed like issues were also like at stake, where between like individual consent and public health effectiveness. Of course, other authors have pointed out that the predominant focus on privacy and in the public and political debate is problematic because, as they pointed out, it hides some more complex social and ethical landscape underpinning the development of in the use of these apps. So, for example, some people have pointed out how they could aggravate social injustice because they could like benefit mainly those who were already better off. Some people were worrying about the legitimacy of the active role that big tech corporations had played in public health decisions, in making public health decisions. Other people looked at issues of transparent governance and how, you know, like the governance of this app and like decisions around this app had been done and be like justified to the public. And some people talked about the importance of addressing issues of public trust. This is really what at some point we got interested in. Because even if we address issues of data protection, of course, the apps are not just there to be used unless they are accepted and citizens decide to engage with them. So how does this happen? What are the conditions to ensure this engagement? That is, in general, like citizens' engagement is, as we have seen, and compliance to measures is a key component in any pandemic response. So this was a question we were interested in, and so how people arrive at elaborating certain normative positions concerning the apps, but also which arguments do they articulate in support of their views and in which values do they involve. So we decided to adopt a bottom-up approach that starts by exploring the views, expectations, and normative stances articulated by the public and citizens. So, and we really took the stance that we cannot ignore citizens' positions in this debate, and actually it can be really helpful to understand where they come from, or to address some of these issues, but so to really make justice in a way that it's not done always in a poll that will have to put them in categories. So that's why we try to work with qualitative interviews. Hi, am I back? Yes, I suppose I am. Perfect, beautiful. What we did, the data that I'm discussing here is part of a larger study called SOLPAN, Solidarity in Times of Pandemic. This larger study, it's a qualitative, comparative, and longitudinal studies of about, including 9 European countries. And now here I discuss the findings from about 300 qualitative interviews between April and May 2020. So the analysis that we did for this that I will present here is not comparative among countries, but what we did was to take this 300, this corpus of like about 300 interviews as a whole, and looked at emerging themes and patterns across the different countries. So what we saw, what we identified was a spectrum comprising 5 different normative positions towards the use of COVID-19 apps. So as you see in this picture, in this like kind of representation, the idea was to not to, you know, what we saw is that clearly it's like not a yes or no. There were no yes or no answers. There were like a lot of diversity. And you could see like the concerned aversion on one hand, like saying, well, we're not going to use it, and this is why, and the support position on the other pole of the spectrum, and then like several positions in between, which we were very interested in. So what we did was to outline each stance, highlighting the kernel of the position expressed and the major argumentative patterns and tropes explored, the type of normative arguments that were being articulated, and the values at stake. So again, just like very quickly, I were the concerned aversion that was like really. I'm concerned. Sorry, I'm concerned, and I will not use it. A position that was distrusting of the feasibility of the app, so saying it will not work, so I'm not going to use it. And it's a position that was trying to really take the balance and look at the trade-offs, so it's understanding that it's a complicated issue, but in the end, it might be worth using it. So it was more, you know, like the tipping exercise, the trade-off exercise was more going towards using them. There was an interesting position that was like really resigned of saying, well, I don't like the idea. I don't think it's really good, but you know, we are already like sharing all this data. We are already like not really able to control it. So, you know, I would use it. You never know, can do something good. And then there was like a very supportive position that was really, you know, endorsing the app. And what we saw was that a consistent element in the spectrum of stances that we have mapped is that the responses tended to frame the respondents tended to frame their thoughts in terms of trade-offs that people are willing to accept or not. So this happened in the ponder deliberation, resignation, and supporting stances, where people were, you know, could be like on one end or the other, saying, well, I will accept the trade-offs or I will not accept the trade-off. But it was like a trade-off kind of argument. And it was in a way like very similar to what I was described before, what it was like also visible in the media discourse, and sometimes in some scholarly debate. At the same time, what we saw that in our analysis that there were other aspects that not all engagements with the apps are framed in this dichotomous way. So the distrusting argument in that sense was particularly interesting because it brings forward issues of feasibility and really public trust to raise that would raise like broader concerns about social and organizational readiness. Another aspect was that also when talking about that also when people, for example, were concerned, there were like different values at stake. So, for example, the issue of privacy was not really, people were not only concerned about individual privacy and individual like data protection, but they were talking very often about like larger, like broader, like democratic value and ideas of collective liberty. So, okay, I said something about the first, these first 3 points. Last point, so I've already like discussed this slide mostly, but the last point I want to make is that one thing that emerged and that I think was very interesting was that there was some deep-seated distrust towards current approaches to the governance of digital technologies. And this was across not only in the distrusting position, but it was like across the different positions. So our findings really reveal that people, irrespectively of the views that they express on issues of privacy and digital tracking, widely conceive of governments as unable to tame the data variance practices that are routinely carried out by corporate actors, which can be interpreted as the perceptions of overall significant limitation of current data governance models. And they also felt that in a way, political leadership was kind of pictured as taking advantage of the COVID-19 crisis to pursue other broader political goals. So very often the mission creep arguments were brought. So to conclude, our findings on perspectives and positions of citizens of 9 European countries of the digital contact tracing apps cut across long-standing debates around the current pitfalls of data governance in Europe and beyond, and point to the relevance of improving the underlying politics of digital technologies and the need to come up with socially robust governance mechanisms that can also be perceived as such by citizens. And is as important as getting data protection right if you want to weave such technologies effectively and democratically into the social fabric. So thank you very much. And this is part of a paper that is in the reference and it's been is out now and it's being reviewed now. And I'm very happy to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Federica, for this very interesting speech. That's the ethical issues related to the part. I told you in advance, I'm speaking to the audience, that also we have different approaches to the same issue. It's intrinsically interdisciplinary, this kind of scenario. And that's why now we are moving to the next speaker, with Ricardo Baeza-Yates. Ricardo is a research professor at Institute for Experiential Artificial Intelligence, Northeastern University. He's also fellow of the Association for Computing Machinery and the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. And Ricardo is talking about problems and errors of COVID data and its use. Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paolo. I'm a data scientist, so I'm not a privacy expert, although I'm working on ethics in AI. I will talk about my experience of 10 months basically analyzing COVID data. So can you go to the next slide? So just to go quickly to some of the problems that we had with this pandemic. So next. So the first thing is the long incubation period, like I would say here 1 week, although it's in average 4 or 5 days. Next. Then you have the problem of the symptomatics, which has been the, I guess, Achilles heel of the problem, because there are many people that don't feel that they are infected and then they may infect other people. Next. And then you have the problem of immunity. So we have recorded cases of people that have been reinfected, and then it's not clear how much immunity you get after having the infection, and also that's important in the case of the vaccine. Next. And the last thing is not only contagious, but it's also lethal. So the fatality rate has been measured near 1%, which is much higher than, for example, influenza or other illnesses that are common today. Next. And then the truth is that it's endemic, because even the most powerful countries like the USA have been really suffer this illness, in the sense that it's not only, it's also about infrastructure, it's about coordination, it's about politics, and so on. Next. Next. Okay, so the first, I will basically go about 10 lessons in the last 10 months I have been analyzing this data. And the one in black are basically intrinsic to the virus. So these are the problems on how to get data. So the first one is that the PCR tests, which are the best tests that we have so far, are imprecise, and also they give us a view of the past. Typically, we are looking data that is 1 week 1 week back in the past. So we are not seeing what is happening today. Only if we go to hospitals, we see what is happening today. And then we have only a sample of contagions, many false negatives, few false positives, and delayed results. Next. So the second issue with the virus has been the ineffective contact tracing. And one problem is how you do the contact tracing. So the sources mainly are reactive cases, so people that feel ill and go to take a test. But then, for example, symptomatics don't get tested, and they never go because they don't know they have the infection. In fact, for example, here I have the priority order of the US CDC, and you see that symptomatics are the last contact that they check, which in my mistake is a big, in my opinion, is a big mistake, because you should check the people that don't feel ill first, just in case they are ill and they are infecting people without knowing it. Next. So what you have here is that we only see some of the cases, and depending on the country, this number differs depending on how effective is the contact tracing, and then most of the cases are never detected. So my estimation is that about 70% of the cases in the US have not been detected. So there are many more people that have been ill than, or well, infected. Not all of them get ill, than we know. And this is true in every country, but that changes. So next. So the third issue is someone that my colleagues in the panel have already touched. Basically, security and privacy contact tracing apps. So I will go very fast, so you have heard about this. But for example, in last June, there was a very thorough security analysis of 17 apps, and only one had the right levels of security. So maybe they were done too fast, but it was easy to basically break on the app and get personal data. Next. And then we have this false dichotomy that I guess is addressed in the first presentation of the panel health, but the truth is that technically you can have the best of privacy and also the best of data protection, but this was not really done by all countries. Next. And then the question is how good were these contact tracing apps, and I would like to touch a different angle. And basically, there's an interesting paper that was published in May by people that really work on ethics of data, and they consider three things like social impact, technology, and governance. Next. So they analyze this social technological framework for 4 different apps, and you see that no one went over 80%, and even one of them, like the UK one, didn't pass the test. Next. The fourth problem is now it's in red because this is an error that is being done even today everywhere in the world, is that this illusion of comparing new cases. So in all the countries, you compare what happened yesterday to what happened today, but that's are not comparable because these two numbers are based on two different numbers of tests. It's like we are measuring the height of people with one case inches and one case centimeters, and then we compare the two numbers. And a good example to see this is what happened in California. So you see the curve in California that you have here on the left, that basically you see that grew really fast at some point in July, August, and you will say, well, things were going really wrong, and you see that also on the right on the death graph. But if you see what was really happening, you see that the things were not exactly like that. Next. Because next. So because what was happening is that California was increasing very fast the number of tests, and that's why the number of cases were increasing. So you see that the slope of the test increase was even higher than how the cases were growing. And what you have to look to be more fair, to be able to compare tests, is basically the fraction of positive tests. And you see that they went down really fast because the number of tests really grew dramatically in a very short time. So you see that from 40% at the beginning, where there were not too many tests, and then good contact tracing, that went down of less than 10%. Next. So the fifth problem is, even that in something that we would say we should have the same standard, we don't. For example, how we count COVID deaths. Yeah. And then you have 3 columns here, one of countries that only count a person that had a positive PCR test, which is not, we know is not true for all people dying from COVID. And then you have countries that also take into account a medical diagnosis. And I would say that we have one country that counts even really suspicion, and that would be Belgium, and that's why Belgium is in the top 2, 3 of mortality rate. Next. And this is there's another confusion, because people don't really distinguish mortality rate, which is death per capita, with the infection fatality rate, which is the real fatality of the infection, with what you can measure today, which is the case fatality rate. But as we said, we don't know all the infected people, so this is overestimated. Next. And then, for example, in this two, one in June, Nature, and the other one in the left is a recent paper on in December that took many studies on infection fatality rate. We see that a number that appear like to be between 0.6% and 1% in some countries now is closer to 1%, and also that grows exponentially with age. So after you are 65, really easily the probability of dying is much higher. So in the next, I will assume that for the world that is much younger than European countries, is about 0.7%, just for the exercise I will do. Next. So one question is, what is the real number of cases? No, next. So let's say we have 2.2 million people that have died today, roughly. Next. So the question is, how many people were infected 3 weeks ago? That is the time you, on average, you have to before dying. Next. And we know that this, let's say, I will take here, sorry, not 0.7, 0.8%. Next. And then we get that we need to have like 275 million people infected to have 2.2 million people dying. But today we only know 86.5 million 3 weeks ago. Next. And then the question is, how many they infected in those 3 weeks? So next. Take the number, the percentage of case increase, or the percentage of death increase in the last 3 weeks. And amazingly, next please, these two numbers are basically the same. Next. So they are 15% more or less each. So we do that next, and we get that today around more than 300 million people have been infected to basically get to that number of deaths. And we know only 100 million today. That was just the news yesterday. So that means more than a 3-factor of cases that we don't know. Next. Next. And then this is one problem was the fallacy of using the case fatality rate that basically depends on how good you do the contact tracing. So this number only shows how much we don't know and contact tracing, nothing else. Next. And here I will go, I will not show this, but basically the underestimation, this factor that was true for the world, you can see it in the last column. You see that in September was almost 18 in Mexico, but it was only like 3.6 in Argentina. And this number changes all the time, and basically lower the number, we are better doing contact tracing, we have more data. Higher the number, we know about this. Mexico has improved this number to 12 now, but it still is not good. Next. The seventh issue is the bias of mortality rate, because really the the infection, the pandemic, doesn't depend on population until you get about 35% of the population infected, which is not the case in almost no country. And here I have just an example from November where you see that Brazil and Chile look almost the same mortality rate, but of course, Brazil had more than 10 times the deaths of Chile, and that's normal because the population of Brazil is 10 times more than of Chile. So both numbers don't tell the reality, but together may tell the reality better. So it's the reality is in between. Next. And we have issues of gender bias. So in most of the world, men are dying more than women, and there are many possibilities, and it's a multifactorial problem. But next, in some cases, like Pakistan, has more than 70% men. Next. Yeah, and then, for example, for health workers, more women have died. And here I have numbers for 3 different countries that you see that it's the opposite. 75% women in hospitals in Italy, US, and Spain. Next. So then the eighth problem is clearly data quality. We have underestimations of most numbers, and basically the red ones are the worst ones, and the black ones are the best ones. Next. So then the last problem has to do with ethics, lack of data transparency. But if you want to be transparent, and some countries have been transparent, next, you need data quality. Because if you have data transparency without data quality, it may be even worse, especially politically for governments. And that happened, for example, in Mexico, and didn't happen, for example, in New Zealand. Next. And then there was obsession to compare in this, I don't know, and then you always compare to the worst countries. And of course, if you compare to the worst, you are not that bad. And this is an ethical problem that you have seen in all the countries, trying to compare to the worst to say, I'm not that bad. But of course, we don't need to compare to learn. Next. And the last issue is basically, I put it in an error, but basically it's more than that. It's just data manipulation. And these are examples from the US, where you see that the bars doesn't match the number, or you see that they reverse the y-axis. Next. Or for example, they show a map that is almost the same after a few weeks, but basically they change the ranges of the data, so it looks like nothing happened, but of course now it's 50% worse. This is in Georgia in the US. Next. And for example, this is the worst case. You see, it looks like things are going better, but if you look at the dates, they are not by date. Next. So this is what I wanted to cover. Thank you.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Ricardo, for your presentation. That's the technical part of the story. That's provide another piece of the general picture of the story. So we are getting a lot of questions. In the meanwhile, we will try to make them at the end. And then I'm very quickly move to the last but not least speaker. So Iñigo de Miguel Beriain. Iñigo is a researcher professor at the University of the Basque Countries on bioethics, law, and legal philosophy and artificial intelligence. He participates in the Panelfit project, who is the organizer of this panel, and is the author of books and articles dedicated to law and data protection issues. So the title of the presentation of Iñigo is Vaccine Certificates and Immunity Passports, Data Protection Issues. Iñigo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paolo. I think that it will be my pleasure, first of all, to try to introduce this kind of new topic that has not been, debated in terms of data protection issues, but also in general in terms of ethical issues. And I think it might be quite a hard topic to address. There are some reasons to consider so. I mean, first, I dare say we have kind of a confusion in the terminology, because it's not so clear how the terminology is quite new, and we are not so used to that. First of all, well, I think that we should distinguish between the idea of vaccination certificates that are just the kind of proofs of vaccination. Vaccination certificate is just a kind of document that is assessing, that is giving evidence that you have been vaccinated. Instead, an immunity passport in general is defined as a kind of official document that certifies that an individual has been infected and is purportedly immune to SARS-CoV-2. I don't really like this name because I think that the idea of passport is not so convenient. I would prefer something like sterilizing immunity certificates or risk-free certificates, and of course, they should not be. They should not be linked directly to the fact of having suffered from the disease from COVID. But I will get in deep with that. So. The problems that we have, or the issues, I will try to be brief. I'm telling you in advance so as to have some time for the debate. But in the case of vaccination certificates, I think that there are two main issues with that. The main problem, in my opinion, is that they are not useful for the purpose that they are supposed to accomplish with. I think that the main idea, whatever justifies this kind of tools, is the idea that they can avoid that infected people who can be infectious, contagious, people that really bring the virus with them cannot arrive into some kind of spaces, cannot access to some spaces where they could be very dangerous for the rest of people. This cannot be ensured with vaccination certificates due to two different reasons. One is that the vaccines do not always work. This means that some people get vaccinated, but they don't get any kind of immunity. The second reason is that we've got now several different types of vaccines. Some of them will provide those who are taking the vaccine sterilizing immunity. All of them probably will provide us with functional immunity, and we will not be able to develop the disease as such. But only some of them, and only until some point, will bring us sterilizing immunity, meaning that you will be able to pass the virus, you will be able to spread the virus even if you are vaccinated. So a vaccination certificate could be somehow misleading in the sense that you could think that you will not pass the virus, you will not spread it, but in fact you will be able to do so. And on the other way around, if vaccination certificates do not serve to distinguish between infectious people and those who are not, I don't think that they are very useful. And on the other hand, they could be very discriminatory, as only those who vaccinate benefit from them, not the rest of people. And somehow they will be introducing a kind of mandatory vaccination system somehow. And I don't think this is a good idea. So if we go now to the immunity passports, then we have a kind of a different issue, and I will concentrate on one of them that is one of the most popular right now. It's the so-called travel pass that has been used by the IATI. And as you know, this is the kind of pass that we will probably need to use to fly from March on. I mean, those are the islands that are really trying to introduce this kind of pass that is supposed to substitute the kind of PCRs that are required right now. Yeah, in theory, this is a different thing because these immunity passports are supposed to give evidence that you are not someone who could put in danger the people who are sharing that space. In this case, the flight or the aircraft with you. But I've got some issues with these immunity passports. I don't disagree on the idea that they could serve well, but first, from the logic of science, if you just give up an immunity passport just because someone has been vaccinated, you get the same problem with that vaccine certificate. I think that we will need further evidence that he or she is not infectious at all. But in terms of data protection issues, my main concern is that, as you can see, because it's circulated, the idea is that more or less that when you will use this kind of immunity passport, you will be sharing some information about whether you have been tested or vaccinated, or whether with someone who will be there and controlling the access to the airplane. And I don't think this is a good idea in terms of data protection issues, because I cannot see why we should do anything like that. And there are some kind of questions that came to my mind, such as, for example, what would be the legal basis for processing in that case is informed consent? But might be, but let's imagine that we expand the use of this kind of immunity passports to some other spaces, such as restaurants, workplaces, or whatever. Would you consider that this could also be based on the grounds of informed consent? I'm not so sure, because somehow you will be much more pressure to use them. So I'm not sure if this would work well. And I don't know if there will be any kind of safeguards to share this data. And I think that it's quite unnecessary. I think that that would be against the minimization principle. So I think it would be better to design a kind of alternative to the system that we have, that is more or less that you are just showing a certificate to someone else. And we could substitute it for another kind of way of doing it. If you go to the next slide, we could see that, what I'm proposing more or less is that we will not be showing that certificate, that it would be a much better idea if you could have kind of a step in between, meaning that for the one who is giving you the certificate will be able to introduce in your device, or will be able to print that you are just showing a kind of green or red light. That will be enough, in my opinion, because you will only have to show this QR to someone who is controlling the access to the space where you are willing to enter into, and they will just know whether you can enter or not, whether you are infected or not, but they will never know what is the reason why you are not infected. They will never know whether you have had the COVID, or whether you vaccinate yourself, or whether you perform a test. So it will be much more sustainable in terms of data protection issues. And I think that this could be perfectly doable. We would just need a kind of technical solution that could introduce a deadline in the green light that you to you. And I think that in this way we could balance much better data protection issues and public health issues. And that's all. I will not speak any longer, because I think that we are about to finish, and maybe we could have some time for one or two questions. So thank you very much, Paolo, and I give the voice back to you.
Okay, thank you. The organizer told me that we are really running out of time, because they have to switch to the next streaming. I don't know if you have time just for one question at least. We got many of them. I also suggest to the audience to write directly to the speaker in case, but I will keep just one, please. So in order to keep the question time. So the first one I got was from Haruro Takazaki, and from empirical of the substance of contact tracing apps, how to get the satisfaction from consumers, any solutions? So I probably, it's a question targeted to Fedirica.
Well, yeah, probably there is. I mean, of course, I'm talking from the point of view of a kind of qualitative study, and what we really wanted to understand was really what were people values and what were people, like normative arguments. So yes, in a way, it is connected to kind of acceptance and to more kind of consumer studies. But it will have to be done through similar. One thing I need to say is that it was we did it very early when some people were not using the app still. So it will have to be done with people who have been using the app, and then definitely this is something that can be done.
Okay, thank you, Federica. We have to go. There were several questions also related to legal basis. We have to close now. Let me finish with a quotation of our Italian Data Protection Authority. I think it's pivotal in that context. The risk to be averted is that of mistaking the waiver of all freedoms for the effectiveness and the blind confidence in algorithms for the all-powerful solution. So thank you all. Thank you to Panelfit again for the organization, and see you around in this very interesting international conference. Thank you again. Thank you to the speakers and to the audience. And
Bye-bye.